I'd like to introduce Laura Seifert-Hertling and Amina Oftedal, thank you, both from Fridley Public Schools. Thank you both for joining us today.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to our presentation. I'm just going to start off a little bit talking about the why and kind of who we are. So we wanted to really talk about our school board policies first, and just really knowing that one of our school board policies is ensuring high academic achievement and levels of performance for all of our students, and really using those good, strong best practice and instructional strategies for our students. So that's really the lens, and we wanted to get to that why we do what we do and why we did what we did, and that was really kind of the why. When we went back and looked at what are our board policies, this is the reason we really took a look at, what we do and why we do it. So who are we? So we wanted to give you a little picture of who we are. We are an international baccalaureate district. We have the pre-K-12 continuum currently. So our demographics as of November 1st are the first two numbers. We have around 3,100 students, and 41% of our students are open enrolled. So we have a very large population of open enrollment within our district. And then the other numbers kind of show us who we are. These are numbers from last year from MDE. So we are 55% students of color. Our free and reduced lunch eligibility is 63% students. We have 16% English language learners, and 15% of our students are special ed students. So that is who we are. And then these are we wanted to talk a little bit about our buildings. So we have two elementary buildings, a middle school, a high school, an ALC, a transition and early childhood program. And the international baccalaureate buildings within our district are two elementaries, our middle, and our high school.
I'm much shorter than Laura. One of the things is, as you take a quick look at the Fridley School District, you see that we are not a large district, but we have a lot of diverse needs in our school district, and we have a lot of diverse stakeholders, because not only do we have our Fridley residents as stakeholders, but we do have strong open enrollment families who select us because of our programming, and those stakeholders are very important to us as well. As a school district, however, we began to want to examine our practices, and what we thought we needed when we started having conversations with DMC through our work with Intermediate District 916 was we really were struggling with our special education service delivery and our staffing models, and we were really looking at that school board priority of fiscal responsibility. And what we wanted was a model that we felt like could give us a little bit more stability and understanding and predicting our special education funding and costs and our staffing needs as we were doing predictions and budgeting and those types of things. That's what we thought we needed. And so we really wanted to take a look at how we were staffing for licensed staff and what we were doing with our paraprofessional services and our related services like the OT and speech and DAPE services. Then we started having conversations with Nate and the folks at the DMC group, and they asked us some kind of provocative questions, and those questions led us to think differently about what we thought we needed, because what we found we needed was not only looking at our special education and related services, but something that we weren't really taking a look at more broadly was even our entire literacy program and our literacy delivery of services for students. And looking at our models for staffing and service delivery, not just for special education, but when we started looking, we realized that our conversation needed to be not about our students just with disabilities, but with all of our students who are struggling across the district. And so really taking a look at instead and challenging us to think about not focusing just on the label or the program that students were identified for, but instead looking at students broadly as these are students who are struggling with success in our schools at all level, pre-K through 12, and how do we deliver service and support to them? So we broadened our ideas a little bit after those initial conversations to look at licensed staff, non-licensed staff, and related services all the way across the board for all students who might struggle, not just those that we've identified as fitting some sort of special siloed need or program. So what we did was we did engage with the DMC folks and had them kind of lead us through what we would want to do and how we would want to begin this particular journey of improving our services and our financial model a little bit as well. So we took a look at focus groups first. And so DMC came in and they facilitated focus groups with staff who were delivering services to students who were struggling. And they helped us kind of craft those questions and kind of dig in a little bit on what perceptions were and what people thought were their jobs and who they were serving. So we did conduct those focus groups with our special ed teachers, with our related services staff, many of our paraprofessionals, and then we reached out to our reading teachers and our Title I teachers, as well as our principals and district administrators. And so each part of that kind of created a different version of a story so that we could get a broad view of what people thought about our services and what our perceptions were and what people could really see as some of the needs that they were identifying from their perspectives in their work. After the focus groups, DMC then shared with us tools, and as Nate shared earlier, we did that time study piece, and so we used the software and did a time study with all of those individuals, every paraprofessional in our district, every special ed teacher, all the related services staff, as well as our reading teachers and our Title I teachers. And so we had all of those folks spend the course of about 10 days entering their time into the time study program, and just collected that as a snapshot of, and we didn't ask anybody to do anything differently, but to just a snapshot of the kind of time, really to figure out what people were doing. Then we also took a look at what our staff to student ratios were in those different programs, and really, as we had been working on the staffing models, we had much of that data, and so we collected that. We looked and did some comparisons of who was actually serving those struggling students, and so we looked at staff expertise, their experience, their success, and their licensures to see who were those most expert teachers and who were they serving. And then we looked at also our student achievement data. And so all of those things were pieces that DMC assisted us with their tools to collect all of that information. What we found was, and when we looked at their final report that they had brought to us, we were not surprised by anything. There was nothing that we looked at and were overly shocked by, because we kind of knew all of these things. But it was really powerful for us, and this was an important first step for us, to see all of that data in one place, to see all of it organized, and then to have it there in those hard numbers for us. It gave us an incredible amount of ownership and power to talk about those things with the staff that had been interviewed, with the staff that had participated in the focus groups, with the building principals, and it really generated a huge amount of conversation to see those graphs, to see those charts, to see that data together. And so that was very, very powerful. We knew that our math and our literacy achievement were not moving. We were just sitting there. We weren't seeing any dramatic increases. We did see some significant inconsistencies, and we really looked at, for example, our core literacy instructional practices. Through those focus groups and through that data collection, we could see some incredible differences in how people were looking at their core instructional practice, and especially in literacy, and how they were defining that and how that was rolling out, even though we were already in our first year of implementation of a brand new adoption of literacy materials for our K-5. people were doing it differently, even though we'd been through all the training together, even though we'd had all of the same materials out there, and we had some strong philosophical beliefs that were in common. We had all of that groundwork already laying there. People were still very inconsistent in how they were interpreting that delivery. And so some of the other inconsistencies that we saw also reflected in how we were doing reading intervention and what we were doing with group sizes there. We saw a huge range of group sizes, very much like Nate shared with you this morning, people doing a lot of one-on-one in our Title I with our reading recovery, and looking at the inconsistencies in one building of other folks who were using small groups and how many students they were able to serve. And so just even looking at those inconsistencies in those two areas for our core instruction and our literacy said, we kind of knew this was happening, but now we can see it on the paper. Laura's going to talk a little bit about what we saw when we looked at our special education.
So some of the things we saw in the special education world were not surprising from what Nate just said a little bit ago. What we saw was there was that direct instruction time. So our special education teachers were spending a lot of time doing paperwork and maybe not as much time directly working with our students. And then when they were seeing students, our group sizes were sometimes 1, 2, or 3. And that's not always bad when you think of 3, but when you're having a student or a teacher spend time one-on-one with a kid for a long period of time, that really takes up a lot of resources. So we really had to think about that shift and how are we going to make sure that our teachers are working with students who have similar needs, because another thing that Nate had also mentioned earlier was you might have a group of 3, but they all have 3 different needs. So how do you work with all those students? That also prompted us to do some scheduling shifting, which we're still in the works. I'm not going to say that we've come a long way and we've done all these things beautifully, but there were some growing pains looking at we need 90 minutes of core instruction, and then in addition to we need that additional 30 minutes for our struggling students. And that was really a mind shift for our special education teachers too, because we were doing what it looked like on that Schedule 1 that Nate had showed us earlier. We were pulling kids out of that core reading, and we weren't giving them in addition to, we were giving them in place of. So we really had to take a look at our practices and what that looks like. For our related services, so OTs and our speech pathologists and DAPE, we really had to look at related services being related back to that primary disability. And we're still working on that, especially with DAPE. We found that a lot of our DAPE services weren't related back to a primary disability. We kind of uncovered that throughout. And then really looking at our related service providers seeing more than one student at a time also. And when we saw those graphs that Nate had showed, our graphs were very similar to that. They really showed some of our providers were working with, bigger groups of kids, and some we really went down to, they have one student that they're pulling at that time. So like Amina had mentioned, looking at wanting to figure out what those needs of those students are, and then we're really breaking down those silos. So we really had to figure out what are our next steps and how do we make sure that we're meeting the needs of all students. And if we have students who are reading at a B level in special ed and reading at a B level, but they're a struggling student not identified, how do we make sure that we can service both those students at that same time? And really trying to figure out our schedules based on that. We also uncovered we had a lot of paraprofessionals in our district. We were probably in the top 95%, 98% maybe with percentile, thank you, with paraprofessionals. So we really had to think about then shifting those resources, because like Nate had said, we put a paraprofessional with some of our highest need students, and we expect all these results even when our teachers are struggling working with these kiddos. We expect paraprofessionals who don't have the training. I mean, let's be honest, they don't have all the training that our teachers do, and we expect them to make those changes. But what happens is we just pull them out and they lose instruction. So we really had to think about shifting our resources and figuring out what do we need versus having a paraprofessional handle all these problems.
So once we had looked at the data and had some conversation with DMC made these recommendations to us. They commended us in a lot of other ways of some of the great things that we were already doing. But you read the commendation page and then you skip over and go right to the recommendation page to see what you need to do. And this is almost word for word the recommendations that they gave us. The underlining is mine. But one of the things that was really important to us was that the recommendations come to us in a very general way. When we engaged and worked with the DMC group, they did a lot of the heavy lifting in conducting our focus groups, in helping us form our analysis questions, collecting our data, doing the analysis, putting that together in a way that makes it really easy for us to visualize and to look at, and then facilitating our conversations about it. But in the end, they brought us these basic kinds of recommendations of things that they saw as some of our greatest needs. This gave us the opportunity to own them. This gave us the opportunity to put them on the table with our own leadership group, with our own teacher leaders, with our principals, with us as directors, and to say, what does this mean for us? What does this look like in our district? When we say, structure strong content support according to student need, okay, those are really nice words, but what does that mean when we look at what we had uncovered? What we had uncovered was that strong content support meant, just as Laura said, we were taking core instruction away from students to provide intervention. So we were not providing that strong content support for them in those classes. We also discovered that we were putting students who had the greatest needs with sometimes teachers or paraprofessionals who didn't have that strong expertise. They were not the strongest teachers in those areas or the strongest staff to be serving those students who are struggling. For example, we have some incredibly talented teachers in our special education staff, but they are not literacy teachers. They did not have a strong literacy background. And so when we pull students with special needs out of their core literacy with a trained literacy teacher and put them with the special ed teacher for their core instruction, we were not giving that student the core instruction with a trained literacy professional. We're like, that's not strong content support. And so it really led to some really fantastic ways of us looking at how we schedule students and what kind of training and support that our staff need as well, and our teachers. The other thing was that additional time for struggling students instead of swapping out time. That's still a mind shift that we're looking at as we look at the limited time in a schedule, but it's really important that we continue to share that message that we want acceleration for these students, not just remediation. And that we looked at that diversity, those inconsistencies of direct instruction from our special ed staff, and really set some guidelines for that. Establishing the group size, we could see those inconsistencies there, and really tried to measure in our own district about what are the right group sizes for our students. And then looking at the related services piece as well. So when we looked at those recommendations, they are general, but they created an incredibly provocative conversation with us as our leaders in our leadership and with our teacher leader staff about what does this mean for us? You know, if these are our recommendations, what can that look like for us? So we looked at, and we knew, just because we had identified that we wanted to do something different with literacy, that we weren't going to get a huge influx of dollars to put more people in literacy. So what we really did was we looked at all of the resources and the folks that we already had serving in literacy and decided to, instead of separating them out into separate pieces, that we would try to braid all of those resources together and really look at how we could serve those students based on need rather than program. So what you see differently now for us versus even 2 years ago is that we have Title I, Special Ed, General Ed, ADSYS, all mixed together in one group because they have the same needs. They all are kids who have need that same phonics intervention, and so they're getting that same phonics intervention every day for 15 minutes for 10 days. So we braided all of those particular pieces together. We looked at our staff, our special ed staff, our gen ed staff, our EL staff, our paraprofessionals, and we reallocated that staff as best we could to create more reading specialists. And so we didn't hire 6 reading specialists out of nowhere for the elementaries. Instead, we reallocated that staff, knowing that putting more paraprofessionals in to pull kids out to work on vocabulary was not as effective as having a trained, licensed reading teacher spend time every day, additional time every day with students. And so we really looked at that very differently. In some cases, we even did a reduction in special ed staffing to create a general ed position for a reading specialist in the secondary. So now I have a trained reading licensed teacher in my secondary meeting with kids every day. Some of them have IEPs, some of them do not. Some of them are EL students, some of them are not. But they all have that same needs, and they're grouped that way in meeting with that reading specialist. And so when we say we increased our licensed reading intervention staff, we did K-12. We put 2 additional staff in our middle school, additional staff in our high school, increased the staff at our elementaries, and but we pulled it from those resources. Those students are still receiving services, but they're getting those more targeted services in that way. We also looked at our master schedules and asked our principals to restructure their schedules so that we have a dedicated intervention time. That intervention time is separate from all other literacy instruction. And that becomes a time not only for students to have literacy intervention, but it can also be a time for them to have related services delivered at that. If it might be speech, it might be OT, it might be other types of things. So we really wanted to create that dedicated intervention time. And then we came back and we spent a huge amount of time with our literacy coordinator and literacy coaches to redefine and help folks understand the expectations and guidelines for core literacy instruction in the classrooms. And that was a real important piece, and to have folks sit around and as a grade level and say, yep, this is what we are agreeing are the guidelines for our word work, for our vocabulary work, for our comprehension, for our guided reading groups. And we had already done a tremendous amount of work and on balanced literacy and guided reading, so that was already laid as a foundation. It was simply how we were using that time, that 90 minutes, and coming to a really consistent understanding about those things. And the expectations for teachers laid out, especially for our new staff that were coming on board. So we continued with the implementation of our literacy curriculum, and we're able to shore it up a little bit more with some of these more definitive expectations on core literacy. Press. Oh. So when we think about our interventions, for year 1 with our interventions, we went directly to the leveled literacy intervention from Fountas and Pinnell for our comprehensive intervention, and really looked at that for those students who needed that comprehensive intervention that includes the word work, that includes the vocabulary, the phonics, and the comprehension skills. After year 1, we realized that that was effective for about half of the students, and that what we needed was more targeted interventions. So we had already started working with the University of Minnesota through a couple of different projects, and so we engaged with them with the press interventions and trained our reading teachers and our literacy coaches in the press interventions, which allows us to do class-wide interventions that are targeted on phonics or vocabulary or comprehension, as well as the tier 2 interventions for small groups. And so we're finding this year as we implement those a lot of much more targeted intervention. It allows us to refine that grouping for students as well. So we do still have our comprehensive interventions, and now we have our more targeted interventions both for class-wide and for small groups. And so that makes a huge difference. We also spent a lot of time engaging our special education teachers that we were asking to work in literacy, providing them with ongoing support and professional development in press, in the leveled literacy, and in the core instruction to strengthen their skills. And also looking at our new hires in special education as folks coming in, asking for those folks to also have reading backgrounds and reading licensure. And that has made a huge difference in not only the confidence and the capacity, but also in the results for those students with special needs if we can be have them more in the core literacy with their gen ed teacher, but then supporting that with folks with strong literacy skills in the special ed services that they have. And that was a really big shift, and our special ed teachers were so excited and so thrilled to be able to increase their capacity to serve students and are being able to see those results. And so including them in all of our intervention trainings as well, knowing that they're going to cross-serve some of those students in those groups that may or may not have special ed students in them, or they may be working with other groups of students as well.
So I'm going to bring my paper up because I want to make sure I tell you everything that we've done with MTSS for behavior. But one of the things that we, like Amina was talking about, really identified teachers to increase the literacy. That was a big undertaking last year, and we're continuing to do that this year. And shifting roles, also shifting roles and thinking about, like I had mentioned, reallocating, just thinking of different ways to think about how we plan for our students who are struggling with that SEL and behaviors. This year what we're doing is we are working to really build our framework, our triangles for MTSS for behavior. We've entered into a partnership with Dr. Clay Cook from the University of Minnesota. He has done 2 days of training in August for us. We identified people in each building to really do the work with us. We probably have a team of about 54 people that meets with Clay. And so we did 2 days in August. We just had a staff development day that we pulled that same team together and really identifying what are our roles, how do we support these students with SEL, because as Nate said, that is a big piece of what we already do. So as a piece of that, we have added intervention analysts, so board certified behavior analysts. We've already hired 2 at the beginning of the school year, and we are onboarding another one soon. And what we did to get those is, like I said, shifting those resources, looking at what are our paraprofessionals doing, and can we hire someone who's more highly skilled, and shift those resources to hire those intervention analysts within our buildings. So we currently have 1 at one of our elementary schools, 1 at our middle school. We're going to be onboarding another 1 at our elementary school, and our high school we're still kind of in the works, just trying to figure out kind of what that system's going to really look like in the following years. And what I can say is the teachers have really enjoyed working with those individuals in those buildings, because they have a different lens for behavior. They can really look at tracking what are those triggers, even if they're little triggers, and then put together plans for those students who are struggling the most. Because when we looked at our suspension data last year, not to say that we were shocked, but we were like, we really need to do something about this, because we know that suspension really hinders students' performance and makes them not like school. So how can we keep those kids in school and make sure that we have highly trained people who are really supporting those students when they're at our school buildings? We also have ADSIS for behavior and academics. We have a really amazing school psychologist who is a wonderful grant writer. And we wrote for ADSIS for behavior and academics. So in our elementary schools, we have an ADSIS behavior teacher and paraprofessional who work in one of the rooms, and we're working for it to be more proactive. Right now, they had a model where students would come down if they were struggling in class. Right now, we're trying to also shift that model to be more proactive, where they're going into the classrooms and floating and really trying to get those students who are struggling before the behaviors happen. We also just wrote for the Support Our Schools grants, and we were awarded 5 social workers. So we are working on onboarding 5 brand new social workers in our district. And then comes the piece of what Nate had also talked about, is those roles and responsibilities. So that's really our next step, is looking at what are the roles of all these folks, what are the responsibilities, how do they play a part in the model of our school to really support SEL within our school district. Also last year, we partnered with Lee Carlson Center in Fridley, and they are providing our School Link mental health support. So currently at our middle school, we have 1.5 people, 1.5 therapists coming in to provide that mental health support. Our high school almost has a full-time person, and our elementaries are still dabbling. They're getting referrals, and they have a few kiddos who we're really working with within our elementary schools. So that's what we're really doing with MTSS for behavior. Oh, we also, I'm sorry, I'm looking at my notes. One of the things we also looked at was our students who are 18 to 21 and those transition students and what we're providing for them. And we we worked on trying to, again, shift resources, and we hired a work-based learning teacher. She was already in our district, so it was just a shift. And she's really trying to work to provide those supports and services to our high school and our transition students to make sure that we're giving them those supports and services of transition so they're ready to move on, so they don't have to access that 18 to 21 if they don't need it, but they're ready to move on to employment, or they have had some work samples and skills, so they're ready when they graduate. Oh, and our related service providers. So we are continuing to work on group sizes. One of the things that we're going to be doing this year is meeting and working on a chart, or kind of a rubric, I guess, is my hope and dream, that will help us guide and understand when we would consider providing related services, because right now it's, well, we think they might need some additional speech or they might need OT, but again, it's not always related back to that primary disability and the why, and if they're making progress, why are we adding support, not taking it away, or making sure that we're not overdoing it. So really our related service provider is going to be working in this year to put together some kind of a support rubric to really help us figure out when we would add those supports. We've also implemented this year a paraprofessional rubric that outlines when we would consider adding paraprofessional support. That's still in the works. We rolled it out in September, and really trying to help identify when would we consider a paraprofessional to be a part of that student's plan, and when would we think about all the other resources that we now have available to support the needs of that student. Oh yeah. I think one of the things that stands out on this slide is just that whole child approach. And with MTSS, that's what we're trying to get to. We're really trying to look at that whole child and making sure that we're not just meeting the academic needs, but the social emotional needs. So with our work with MTSS and Clay Cook this year, that is one of our big pushes, is really trying to figure out how do we meet the needs of that whole child. We're looking at the ACE score, so the Adverse Child Experience questionnaire, those 10 questions that kind of impact what what outcomes that the child may have, and that trauma impact. And like I said, we are adding some board certified behavior analysts and social workers to our district.
I think one of the things that stood out from what Nate said today was, and we saw it very clearly, that you need to address the social emotional learning component for the other best practices to really have an impact. And so as we worked very, very hard in literacy, when we looked at putting together those resources and identifying the interventions that students need, I heard many times, well, that child's not in the reading intervention group because of their behavior. And so we had students who were not participating in core instruction. We had students who were not participating in small group interventions because of their behaviors. And so looking at the whole child and being able to address those in order to make sure that students have access to core instruction and to the appropriate interventions, because we have the other support services in place, the ADSIS for behavior, those types of things, as well as the behavior analysts are making a real impact on making sure that those students continue to have access to that core instruction for their literacy. So when we think about what we did with the recommendations, we really looked at the expertise and the staff that were delivering our literacy instruction. We looked at our schedules and were we providing the schedules. In our secondary, the schedule was pretty easy for us to do. We had dabbled in previous years of having students be in that special reading language arts block that replaced their regular language arts block with a lot more reading instruction. We did not see success with that. And so the model that we're using now at the high school is that it takes an elective block spot for the students. They have their regular language arts class, their regular math class, those types of things, but they do have that every day 45, 49 minutes of reading instruction from a licensed reading teacher at the high school, if they've been identified for that particular service. And that those students are also grouped by tier needs as well. So we are pushing students from one tier to the next until we can onboard them out of the reading class into their other electives. In the middle school, we do the same piece. Making sure that one of their electives blocks is set aside for reading intervention rather than taking them out of any core instruction. And that has really garnered some tremendous success. There's just nothing like having 45 minutes every day with a licensed reading teacher working on targeted interventions, and that has made a huge difference for students. And in the elementary, looking at that master schedule, setting aside that 30 minutes in addition to their regular core literacy block of 90 minutes, it makes a big difference. One of the pieces when we look at also setting those guidelines for group instruction, we do have, Laura has set those guidelines for related services. She's set those guidelines for, and we've set those guidelines for literacy intervention as well, that we really want to say, I know that sometimes you can't have 5 kids in a group, sometimes it's 4, but you're not going to have 1 or 2 students in a group. We're going to really make sure that we have as much face-to-face direct instructional time with our most experienced staff with students. And so really trying to make sure that we're having folks follow those particular guidelines. If we want to flip the next one. So a couple of things. This has been a very challenging shift and change. Part of it is that it is incredibly important for us to make sure that every stakeholder in the district understands the why of why we are making these shifts and changes. We continue to struggle with, from folks, whether they're teachers, paraprofessionals, parents, even students and principals, asking the questions. They come back and they say, now, why do we need to do this again? Why is this important? And so to come back and make sure that we clearly articulate those whys. And DMC has provided us with a couple of good strategies to help continue to articulate that and to make that part of our common conversation so that we can have that unity as we move forward with some things. There are oftentimes, as we continue down this journey, some not lack of common understanding about the needs and the strategies that we're using. And so that becomes a very important piece. We cannot move forward until we have folks that have that common understanding and we can get their beliefs in the same place in order to move forward. It is the principal becomes the key person in making these successful in the buildings and engaging the principals from the front end of looking at those strategies and the needs, looking at the data, and then having them work to help engage us with the stakeholders in their building and providing as much support as possible for those principals. And having that visible and consistent leadership in the buildings, making sure that it's not just the principal standing alone in the buildings delivering that message, but making sure that all of us, whether it's the literacy coach, the coordinators, myself as the director, Laura, all of us are there at whatever the principal needs to make sure that that message is clear, that we want to be supportive and offer those supports to staff. And then finally, having that clear evaluation plan. We did engage with DMC to develop the return on investment procedures and processes, and we continue to do that, where we are looking at the effectiveness of the program in terms of student achievement and in terms of cost, and looking at how much do these interventions cost us per student, and are we getting a strong return on investment. And so really looking at that to see that we are being as cost effective as we possibly can, but still garnering results, and so that the strong effort is also resulting in strong results. And we continue to gather the data and continue to look at those particular pieces, and the return on investment procedures they're incredibly eye-opening. They're a little wonky when you start looking at the data and the percentages and all of those kinds of things, but in the end you do end up with, we had this much success for this cost. And that's another way for us to be looking at those pieces and making adjustments based on that. Whether or not the strategies we're using are really effective for kindergarten, we're not seeing those results for the kind of money that we're putting into those, so we need to make a shift or a change for that, versus very successful for 5th graders. And so making those kinds of decisions and changes about how we want to best adapt and change our programs.
I think just another thing that I'd like to echo what Amina said, it has been hard work, and I think having that data in front of you is so impactful because then you can really see what's going on, and we continue to use data. I was in one of the principal's offices the other day talking about just some of our MTS rollout, and he said, Laura, I have to come show you something. And it was a graph of the students who were struggling, not identified as special ed, but students who were struggling with behavior, and had some real good baseline data and had some interventions, and then had what they were doing and how it was improving, or if it wasn't improving, what they were doing. So I think just being able to look at that data is so critical and so important, and we can make decisions based on that a lot quicker than, oh, well, now it's been 6 months and we're not sure this didn't work and we don't know why. Another piece that I think that we've really learned is just that fidelity piece, is being able to implement things with fidelity. Because if we say, well, we tried it for 2 weeks and it didn't work, and then we go back and say, well, it wasn't done for 15 minutes every day for the past 2 weeks, it's not going to work. So we really have to make sure that we're implementing our interventions with fidelity throughout our district. Another thing I want to talk a little bit about, Amina mentioned earlier, is those braided funds and how we did that, because I know I've talked to some people about that and they go, wait a minute, what are you doing? You have special ed kids and with your ADSIS kids, and the state says we can't do that. Well, they do say we can't do that, but what we did is we did a time study of our teachers, and we looked at what kids are we serving. So are they title kids? Are they ADSIS kids? Are they special ed kids? And we did a time study, and then what we do in the background in our finance department is we just code those teachers time to those areas. So we're able to break down those silos in that way. And it's been approved. We can do it. We've asked. And I think, just want to make sure that we tell people we have done that. It's been approved. But I think that was a real creative way, because then we don't have 3 different groups teaching the same thing, which didn't make any sense to us. So it's still a work in progress. The schedules are probably our biggest barrier and the trickiest piece still, just trying to figure out, you have this group of 4th graders and they have this teacher, but they don't go to specials, or their win time is a little bit different. How do we make sure that we're pulling those kids at the same time? But we're still working out those kinks, and we're trying to work on it. I think the biggest pushback from me in special ed was we might have to service kids during Phi-Ed time. And that was a big pushback from teachers. Like, well, we can't pull them out of Phi-Ed. Well, we can't pull them out of reading either, because here's the data on reading, and we need to make sure that they can read. And I know Phi-Ed's important too. It's all important, but we have to find a place. But I think that's the biggest pushback I got from my special ed teachers as we looked at shifting schedules and trying to figure out when to support and service the students, was just during the specials time. Nobody wants to miss specials. And we really had to have some good conversations about that. And again, bring some data. Why is reading so critically important to these kiddos, and why do they need to be able to learn it?
So when we look, as Laura said, what do we have next to do? It is the fidelity. And even when we're looking at our core instruction, we focused this year on training our literacy coaches to go in and do classroom observations of literacy instruction, just as a feedback tool to the classroom teacher, to make sure that we are implementing our core instruction with fidelity, that we do have folks following through on what those guidelines are, and then also looking at our intervention fidelity. As Laura said, we want to make sure that before we start saying this doesn't work, or we need to try something different, that we are documenting that we are actually implementing those curriculums, those interventions, those strategies with their intended use. We're continuing to work on our program evaluation and our analysis for the effectiveness, and really taking a look at how do we bring those folks together to have those conversations about what's really working. And it leads to fantastic conversations with teachers about assessment data, about looking at how do we target kids, and this year looking at class-wide interventions for when we see classes that have significant numbers of students who are in need of some support in a single area, and that the class-wide interventions from press that the teachers can deliver right there for all the students. And so we've seen some excellent results for that as well.
So what do we have to do next in special education? So what we found out with the high number of paraprofessionals that we had was if any general ed teacher had a child with an IEP on their in their classroom, they needed a paraprofessional. Didn't matter if it was a student with a learning disability. It was really, well, I have some kids in my class who have special needs. I need a paraprofessional. So really shifting that mindset of being more inclusive and being okay with having those students. And we're still working on that. Creating more child-specific IEPs. That's one of our big goals this year, is to make sure that our IEPs are very specific to the needs of the child, because what we found was the accommodations and modifications page started to get about 3 pages long because we had copied everything from year to year to year, and we never took anything off, and we never really looked at that in our IEP meetings. So last year what we developed was just a meeting agenda for all of our IEP meetings. So every case manager was hitting all those areas that we need to hit legally on our IEP meetings. And what we're going to engage in the work this year is just really looking at what do those IEPs say and being more child specific with paraprofessionals, using that rubric, with our related service providers, with our LREs, with all those pieces, and even the services, making sure that it's really reflecting what the needs of the students are. Because what we found also is some of our teachers were saying, well, yeah, we know that they need that. We'll just put them in that class, and we'll pull them out for that reading intervention, and we don't have to document that. Well, yeah, we do. So just really making sure that all those pieces are being met. And then a focus on problem solving instead of admiring that problem. So this is year 2 for me and Fridley. I would sit in child study meetings, and it would be, well, he doesn't eat breakfast, and his parents don't make him go to bed on time, and well, we can't really, all these things that we don't control, instead of really focusing on, well, what is the problem in school? Well, this kiddo's in the hallway all the time, and they're disrupting other kids. Well, okay, we've identified the problem. Now let's really figure out why that's happening. When is it happening? What can we do to intervene during that time? So that's a big focus too. For staff development this year, I meet with weekly with a team of school psychologists, my social workers, my coordinators, and really are working on developing what does that problem-solving model look like within our child study teams, and then also to bleed that over into other pieces. What does it look like when we meet as grade level teams? What does it look like when we meet as student support teams? So really having a problem-solving process, and we have 3 minutes to talk about each kid, and that's it. We're going to try to get that focus on 3 minutes per kid, so we're not admiring problems, we're really focusing on problem-solving for our students and putting together some strong plans.
So a couple of takeaways. One is that through all of this particular process, we as a school district have not really cut our costs any. We have not saved a ton of money, and suddenly our finance director is like, woo, that's $100,000, What we have done is we have shifted our resources. And so our budget isn't any smaller, but we feel like we are spending our money in a more effective way, that we're reaching more students, we're providing more services to students, and using the return on investment and our program evaluation, seeing how effective those particular investments in the money can be. So that's a real takeaway for us. It lets us look at a larger framework for supporting our struggling students across the district, not just supporting them in literacy, not just supporting them in behavior, but looking at it as a whole framework and having folks talk about that with common language and common purpose. And that really pulls folks together. And I think that as we continue, there's always a ton of challenges. Sometimes it's belief systems, sometimes it's systemic things like, can we actually fit that many things into the time limit in the schedule? How do we run the buses to get kids where they're supposed to be? So we have some of those systemic things. We have lots of professional development that we're doing. What we have found from across the board, from special ed, general ed, behavior intervention folks, our people are so excited to take part in that professional development that addresses things that they think are important on the table. They want to be in literacy professional development. They want to be in behavior management professional development. They want to be part of those teams that are discovering the solutions to the problems that they see on the table. Our folks are just really super eager to participate at all levels. And so it's been a real challenge, and there continues to be pushback, and there continues to be struggles that we have. It is difficult work, and sometimes we look at each other and we get a little tired. But we see the results, and we see the excitement that it generates with all of our folks in the buildings, and it's very exciting work for us.
Amina, do you want to talk about cultural responsive lens? Cultural responsive lens.
Yes. One of the pieces too that as we are looking at the whole child, we have started, this is our year one of an ongoing journey working with cultural responsive classrooms and really making sure that that lens is embedded, whether we're talking about literacy. In fact, sometimes we forget to say it out loud because we're looking at it, whether we're looking at literacy and curriculum development, whether we're looking at behavior interventions, whether we're looking at our MTSS plans for math or literacy or academic support, that we always have that as a lens and continuing to this year we started with a lot of leadership training on cultural responsive because we learned the lesson about making sure everybody knows the why and can articulate those common understandings and strategies. And then we'll continue to roll that out to staff and see that impact of those cultural responsive classrooms and cultural responsive strategies in our classrooms moving forward.
So the question was, can I unpack the braided finance just a little bit more? So really what we did is, because we had the ADSYS program and we had our title and we had special ed, we did a time study, a 2-week time study on the teachers who were working in those areas. And then we took the percentage of the time that they were worked with those students, and in the back end, we coded them to those areas.
So essentially what it looks like is our financial specialist in the finance office looks at the students that are being served by a teacher, and the teacher may be a licensed special ed teacher, but they are serving during their day, they may be serving 30% of their students in general ed, our general ed students, and so they would be coded 30% to general ed. They would be serving so many Title I students, and so they would be coded to Title I for that amount, and special ed for that amount, and ADSYS for that amount. And so in the cases that those students were being served that way. And so we don't have, it's very rare that we would have a teacher working in literacy intervention who would be 100% pure ADSYS code. Instead, we looked at, and then we continue to do the daily time studies for them, and they identify the students which they serve, and then we identify the label that student is. And so it's less front-facing for the teacher and much more front-facing for the financial analyst.
What does your IEPs look like for somebody who is in that braided model? Like, where are they receiving the services? What do the minutes look like in the setting on the IEP?
So we're still working on those pieces. So the question was, what does an IEP look like for those students? We actually did end up shifting some students to more of an indirect model of special ed services, where that special ed teacher was just checking in with a literacy teacher if that is the person that we decided that would be providing that instruction. So we have some students who currently were served with our special education teachers who are now being served with the literacy teacher, and it's more of an indirect model. So we might put 15 minutes per week of indirect time where we know that they're just connecting and making sure that they're making progress in those IEP goals.
Laura, can you speak to how this has impacted your Setting 3 programs for those students who show that level of need and support?
Our setting, so like what Nate had said earlier, so this is really for our students who are probably more our Setting 1 and 2 students. Our Setting 3 students are still, those significantly multiply impaired kiddos are still in those Setting 3 programs. Our students with identified as autism are still within our Setting 3 autism programs. It's our students who that Setting 3 EBD student who might be able to access academically. We're still working on that and trying to figure out how to balance that, because there are some days where absolutely they can attend and some days they just can't. So we've been working to try to get our Setting 3 teachers some training too in literacy so they can be that person who provides that literacy, but we still don't have them included in all of those classes.
And I think many of our Setting 3 teachers, some of our new hires this year have been folks with reading licensure, and so really trying to improve the capacity of those teachers in the Setting 3, making sure that the students have the core materials, the instructional materials for the Gen Ed core literacy as well. And so really trying to offer more support to our Setting 3 teachers so that students have that access.
We also have literacy and math coaches in our district too, so we send those folks out to our Setting 3 teachers to really try to focus in on, what are some of those skills that they need, what kind of training do they need in that curriculum, because we do have a lot of new folks this year in our Setting 3 programs. So we really lean on our coaches to support those teachers too, those new teachers.
You mentioned results quite often. Can you, what kind of achievement results have you seen since you switched to this model?
One of the things last year, in March, we did the shift in the elementary schedules to do dedicated win time. So we only had the time from March until May. We did not see significant results there for student improvement, mostly because they just didn't have a lot of significant time. This year, we're still waiting for our results from our winter assessments, and we're hoping to see some impact there. We know that the results will be slow because we're still struggling with some fidelity pieces. In our secondary, where we did have that dedicated time last year, we saw significant numbers of students exiting out of the reading support into general ed and no longer requiring that. We saw probably about 30% of our students who were identified initially for reading support in the middle school exit out before the end of the year or by the end of the year for reading support, and so that made a huge difference. Sometimes it was motivational. For secondary students in literacy, a lot of times it's motivational, giving those kids clear targets and a dedicated person who can support them and target those interventions on those pieces that they needed. So we saw some really strong, significant results in our middle school, mostly because of the fidelity piece that we had there. We did return on investment studies in math and our AVID programs to establish the model, and I think we saw some really strong results in how that model worked, and so we're excited to be able to apply it this year. So the answer to your question is we're still waiting for those in terms of system results. What we're looking at now are some class-wide results and seeing those in kind of the microcosm, and we're seeing some nice pieces with our class-wide interventions this year. Just as we're looking at that data as at a class-by-class basis.
What is the plan for your English learners who are exiting?
One of the things that we look at too is when we look at our English learners, especially those who are scoring a little bit higher, above the 3.5 level in language proficiency, and not our newcomers in any way, but those 3.5, the 4.0s in literacy, we've started using the literacy composite for identifying students for literacy intervention in addition to any EL services. And making sure, because in the past, if a student was EL and receiving EL services, they didn't receive any literacy intervention, and we wanted to make sure that we didn't deny access to students with language needs into literacy and supported, as Nate said, more academic vocabulary to help build their structures. What we do see is that when we students who may exit out of the EL program may still qualify for literacy services, and so we continue to serve them in literacy intervention, even though they may have already exited out of the EL program. They still show up on our intervention needs for reading support, many times in comprehension and vocabulary, and so those would be the targeted areas that we would serve them.
Any other questions? I think we got a couple more minutes left, so.
I just had a question about your what universal screeners you're using for your ATSS model, both academically and for needed for academic.
So with academics, we just we still use the NWA, and we just started using FastBridge. So FastBridge is becoming our universal screener at our elementary levels and for our intervention students at the middle school and high school. For behavior, what we've done this year so far, we are still working with Dr. Clay Cook to really look at what screeners we want to use. FAST has the SABRE, so it is a social emotional screener. We're going to pilot that with some of our elementary classrooms this year because we have that as a tool. But we also at our elementary levels have given out just a internalizing, externalizing paper, and it's just honestly a sheet of paper, and teachers would look at internalizing and externalizing behaviors, and they would list 3 students if they have 3 students in their class. And then our school psychologist is working on compiling that data and making sure that we're not missing students who we haven't already identified. So we're at ground level right now, just really working, as Dr. Clay Cook will tell us, we're dabbling this year. and just trying to pilot different pieces and see what works best for us. But currently dabbling a little bit with FAST and then doing those just paper screeners.
Any other questions this morning? All right, looks like you guys are off the hook. So Laura and Amina, thank you very much.